is a time in which art and literature were drawn into modes of concealment that prevented people from recognizing the realities of their plight. And part of what has contributed to the Great Derangement is a series of partitions. A partition from nature and culture, from the human and the non-human, language and image, individual, collective, subject and object. I want to turn and maybe address the first question to Gabriela, whose work also deals with disturbing these binaries and maybe perverting, creating these binaries. If you could talk to us a little bit about your short story work and how it focuses on objects in terms of thinking along these lines, and how you're thinking, having just read The Great Derangement, you find a lot of resonance in that.
Well, to me, it's very clear, and Amitav mentions this time and time again, that the stories we tell about the world shape the world that we live in. It's not just that the world gives us the stories actually give us the world, right? Or make the world. And that's why stories matter so much, I think, to all of us and to many of the people who participate in this event. But it's also why certain stories that have been dominant stories have led us here, this moment of climate injustice and climate crisis. And also why it's important to sort of shed light on those stories of resistance that have always coexisted with those dominant stories, and that have insisted on telling the world in a different way. In telling a world that is hybrid, that has not been divided into nature, culture, male, female, good, bad, black and white. And I think that coming from a place like Mexico, where Western and non-Western beliefs coexist in friction, in difficulty sometimes, in oppression and resistance sometimes, but they coexist. This sort of came naturally to me.
Following from these rich ideas, I want to ask you something about place and about process. One of the arguments and critiques in this book is about the separation between the individual and the collective, and how the novel has focused so much on the individual, and it's of course a reflection of also individual capitalism and the place that freedom occupies in our ideologies, etc. But I wanted to ask you if different kinds of artistic processes, even collective writing processes, might not reintroduce the collective into like this singular, very solitary, traditionally task of writing.
That's a very interesting question. I think thinking about these things has really made me also reflect on my own practice as a writer, Because all my life, really, I've just sat in a room, all by myself, writing away. And then the book is printed and published and goes out to a reader who reads the book all by themselves. So it's a completely individualized experience. And, as Marshall McLuhan says, the medium is the message, That kind of individualization creates individualization and further individualization and so on. So I certainly felt it very important to try and reclaim some sort of collaborative aspect, to my work. And so I did this book called Jungle Nama, which is actually an adaptation of a folk tale told in the Sundarban, which is the world's largest mangrove forest. It's in Bengal. And the central character in this story is a figure called Bon Bibi, which means the lady of the forest. And in fact, she's often treated as a goddess, as a goddess of the forest. But the curious thing about it is that this story, there are two textual versions of it, and both are written by Muslims, very, very believing Muslims. And they trace her ancestry back to Medina. So she comes from Medina to Bengal and she settles the land and so on and so forth. And she quells the tiger and creates a balance between the forest and the human. But what's so interesting about this is that in fact you can see her as a goddess, but you can also see her as a saint. Like a Sufi saint, and these sheikhas exist across not just the Islamic world, but also the Catholic world.
The pandemic was a challenge to the imagination in such a way, and I'm wondering if living through the pandemic, if being students of what happened during the pandemic, also transformed your imagination, your work, and also what was possible in terms of our contribution to diminishing climate change or whatever margin is still possible, because gigantic transformations in conduct suddenly happened to save our own life. I'll start with you, Amitav, for that question, if that's okay.
Well, during the pandemic, while we were living through it, a lot was written about how the pandemic might be a sort of real dividing line, a break between one mode of existence and another mode of existence. But friends of mine who are historians all cautioned against thinking in this way, because they said that, the historical evidence on epidemics shows that, in fact, after the epidemic is over, people go back to the old ways with twice as much vigor, And in effect, I think that's what really happened with the pandemic. It had, on the one hand, this terrible impact, which I don't think we're going to see the end of for a very long time, where it, I think, really had very long-lasting psychological effects on many people, but especially upon young people. And those disturbances are already manifesting themselves, especially in the US, where you see, the crime rates soaring, where you see, mental health issues, especially amongst young people. Friends of mine who teach in universities say now that, almost in every class, someone breaks down and starts crying, and it's men as well as women, So there's that. On the other hand, the pandemic has also had this terrible effect of accelerating things from before. I really wonder if this war in Ukraine would have started, if not for the pandemic. So, I think it's also allowed governments to tighten their grip on the media and to create these very authoritarian systems. So, at the end of the day, I think the pandemic has just been a disaster for all of us who are concerned about the climate.